The alarm shattered the silence like it always did, sharp, mechanical, too real. 5:25 a.m. is my favorite hour, though I'd never say that out loud. I silenced it with a practiced flick of my fingers and laid there for a breath longer, staring at the ceiling as it slowly turned from shadow to soft gray. Alvin was beside me, back turned, shoulders still rising and falling in a rhythm I'd memorized years ago. Quietly, I slipped out from under the sheets. My feet found the rug automatically, my hand reaching for the phone on the nightstand. I tapped open my playlist, letting soft morning music, piano keys, cello, gentle and slow, spill into the room, soothing the heaviness in my chest that never seemed to lift. Every morning followed the same choreography, a silent shuffle to the bathroom. The ritual I clung to, not out of habit, but because it was mine. It was the only part of my life that hadn't blurred at the edges. The bathroom greeted me like an old friend, tiles cold under my toes, lavender body wash still uncapped from yesterday. I didn't bother fixing it. I liked it that way. Unfinished. Human. I turned the handle and the water began its slow, groaning flow, filling the air with rising steam. I watched the mirror fog up, soft and slow, until my reflection disappeared completely. That's when I felt safest, when I couldn't see myself. The scent of lavender bloomed around me, wrapping itself around my senses. The heat hadn't kicked in yet, but I didn't mind. The cold bite of early water reminded me I was still here, still breathing. Still Nina. As I reached to undress, my fingers lingered at the hem of my shirt. I paused, not from hesitation, but from something else. A sense. A pull. An awareness that I wasn't alone, even if no one was in the room with me. Caden. Down the hallway, his room always had the faintest creak when his mattress shifted. A sound I pretended not to hear. He moved like a ghost in the mornings, quiet and careful. But I noticed. I always noticed. At first, I told myself it was innocent. Teenage footsteps, harmless curiosity. But that was a lie I let myself believe for far too long. The door didn't creak on accident. The mirror angled just slightly. The way the light from the hallway hit the frosted glass of the shower door. I saw it all. Not in a flash. Not all at once. But piece by piece. And I never said a word. I stepped into the shower. The cold water slapped against my skin and pulled me from the edge of whatever thought I'd almost slipped into. My breath caught, but not from the temperature. There it was, the click. Barely audible. The slight shift in pressure as air moved behind the door. The one I never locked. On purpose. My eyes stayed closed. My body moved on its own. Lather. Rinse. Breathe. I didn't need to look to know he was there. I could feel him. Watching. The heat from the water had started to bloom against my shoulders, turning sharp droplets into silk as they trailed down my spine. I stood still, arms half raised, fingers paused in their lather as the familiar sensation crept in, not from the water, but from the air beyond the shower door. It was subtle at first. A shift in pressure. A whisper of cold that slipped across the floor and ghosted up the back of my legs. I knew that sensation now. It had a rhythm, a routine. The same time, the same sequence. Caden, my 18-year-old stepson, was there. He always was. I didn't look. I didn't need to. That particular stillness on the other side of the door had a shape, and I'd memorized it. It wasn't some sudden revelation. I hadn't just discovered his voyeurism. It had unfolded slowly, like steam rising in a quiet room. The first time, I'd caught a glint of something at the base of the door, a mirror, palm-sized, propped at an angle so slight it could have been innocent. I stared at it, frozen, soap dripping from my elbows. I had a dozen choices in that moment. Slam the door shut, scream, confront. But I didn't choose any of them. Instead, I reached for the shampoo and kept going. And that's how it began. Or maybe, how I allowed it to begin. At first, I told myself it was a passive allowance. A mercy. Teenage curiosity was harmless, wasn't it? Boys peek. Stepmothers forgive. But deep down, it wasn't mercy. It was needed. My own. Because long before Caden started watching, I'd already felt invisible. Alvin and I had stopped existing in the same emotional time zone. We passed each other like strangers who once shared something but no longer even nodded. When he touched me, if he touched me, it was out of routine, not desire. I'd started to wonder if I'd aged out of attention. If I'd quietly crossed the line into someone who existed only in the background. But then came the stillness behind the door. Caden's stillness. Not the boldness of a man, but the reverent pause of someone seeing something they shouldn't and being unable to look away. And I let him. Morning after morning. Today, though, it felt different. Closer. Heavier. The fog was thick now, curling against the glass like smoke, blurring everything into soft shapes and shifting silhouettes. I ran my hands up my arms over my shoulders, slow and deliberate, not out of vanity, but something closer to defiance. My breath came a little deeper. My movement slowed, intentionally fluid, like I was performing a ritual I'd memorized in my bones. Behind the door, I sensed it, his presence, barely restrained. Not moving, but burning. The air practically pulsed with tension. The soft music I'd put on earlier drifted in from the bedroom, muffled but melodic, slow piano, something nostalgic, something that made the moment feel too cinematic to be real. I tilted my head back, water spilling over my collarbones, eyes closed, lips parted, not in pleasure, but in surrender. To sensation. To thought. To the truth I'd buried under weeks of pretending. I should have felt disgusted. I should have been furious. But I wasn't. What I felt was far more dangerous than either. I felt awake. A part of me, the part one hated the most, ached to know what his face looked like right now. What his hands were doing. Whether he'd pressed the door open just a little more, or if he'd run the second I acknowledged him. And then, for the first time, I moved toward the door. Not fast. Not in panic. I stepped carefully, silently, water trailing off my skin like threads of silk. I reached for the knob, not to slam it shut, but to meet the moment halfway. The metal was cool under my fingers. My pulse quickened, a low thrum in my ears. The heat of the shower contrasted with the cold air creeping in from the crack below. A line had already been crossed. I was just making it visible. My grip tightened. And I turned the lock. Slowly. A soft click echoed through the fog. Then, I opened the door just a few inches. Just enough to unwrite the rules I'd been pretending still applied. I didn't look out. I didn't say a word. I simply turned back to the water and stepped into the steam, letting it carry the weight of what I'd just done. Behind me, I felt it, that sharp intake of breath, the stillness breaking. He knew I'd seen him. And now, he knew I'd invited him. You might as well come in. The words slipped out before I could stop them, low, steady, threaded with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. They hung in the steam-heavy air, delicate and irreversible. No tremble in my voice. No anger. No fear. Just an open door and the truth that I wasn't pretending anymore. Behind me, the bathroom stayed quiet, too quiet. The hum of the shower, the soft piano bleeding in from the bedroom, and then, that shift. The quiet scuff of socked feet against tile. Hesitation. Breath held. Time slowed into something syrup-thick and strange. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. My hand rose to the glass wall of the shower, palm flat against the heat-slick surface, grounding myself. The water kept flowing, a curtain between thought and action. It beat down on my neck, sliding over my shoulders, my spine, my thighs. But I barely felt it anymore. He moved closer. I could sense it in the change of air, the way the draft from the hall vanished, swallowed by his presence. There was a pause just outside the frame of the shower, a second heartbeat joining mine in the room. He was inside now. With me. No longer hiding. No longer watching from the shadows. I lowered my hand from the glass, let it trail slowly through the steam beside me, muscles taut and trembling with restraint. Every inch of me was aware of him. The space between us. The impossible closeness of two people pretending not to breathe each other in. For a moment, we stood like statues, me under the water, him just out of reach. The heat was unbearable, the air too thick. I shifted, finally, and looked over my shoulder. He was standing by the sink, fully dressed, eyes wide and uncertain. His shirt was damp from the humidity, clinging awkwardly to his skin. His hair was messy, his jaw tense, and his hands were frozen at his sides like he didn't trust them. He looked like he was about to speak, apologize, flee, but he didn't. Instead, he took a step closer, and I didn't move away. My pulse kicked against my ribs like it wanted out. I lifted one hand slowly, brushing wet strands of hair from my cheek, watching him through the fogged glass. He stared back at me, not boldly, not with confidence, but like someone caught between guilt and wonder. His lips parted, his voice barely audible over the water. "I didn't think you knew." That was the second thing spoken between us that morning. The last thing we ever said before everything changed. I didn't respond. Not with words. Instead, I reached for the handle of the shower door. My fingers closed around it, hesitated, and then pulled. The glass swung open with a quiet creak, releasing a wave of steam that rolled over his shoes and across the tile like a slow exhale. He was only a few feet away now. I stood there, skin damp and glistening, water dripping from the ends of my hair. I didn't cover myself. I didn't step aside. I just watched him. And waited. There was a look on his face I'd never seen before, part fear, part awe, part something I couldn't name. He took one more step forward, then stopped, staring at the water pooling at his feet. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he reached for the hem of his shirt. It came off in a single, shaky movement, sticking slightly to his back from the damp air. He looked smaller without it. Softer, human, still a boy in so many ways, but already carrying a hunger he didn't yet understand. I stepped backward, into the heat of the shower again, letting the door remain open. I should have said no. I should have told him to leave. I should have ended it with silence. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and closed my eyes as the water slid down my chest and waited for the sound of his footsteps. Waited for the warm breath that would hit my back. Waited for the quiet collapse of everything I'd once believed about myself. He came to me, not in a rush, but like he was wading into something forbidden. His presence filled the small space, trembling and unsure, but real. I felt the weight of his nearness before I felt his touch. And when I finally did, it was light. Barely there. The kind of touch that asked more than it took. The kind that said, "Are you sure?" And my body answered before my mind could. The water eventually ran cold, but I didn't flinch. I barely noticed. I stood there beneath it, eyes open, unblinking, like maybe the chill would do what the heat couldn't, bring me back to myself. The steam had thinned, drifting toward the ceiling like smoke after a fire. Everything in the bathroom looked hazy, not from moisture anymore, but from the strange unreality of the moment we'd just lived inside. I reached for the handle and shut off the water. The silence that followed was deafening. No drops, no breathing, no music anymore, just the low hum of the light overhead and the steady rhythm of my heartbeat in my ears. Stepping out of the shower felt like leaving a dream mid-sentence. My foot touched the mat, and I grabbed a towel, wrapping it slowly around myself, as if covering up could undo anything. Caden stood by the door, shirt back on now, hair damp, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was unreadable, still flushed, but quiet. Unmoving. There was no trace of boyish mischief, no triumph, no shame. He glanced up briefly, then looked back down. And then he stepped into the hallway and disappeared. I stayed behind, frozen in place, surrounded by fading heat and the smell of lavender and something else now, something I couldn't name. I didn't know how long I stood there, towel clutched around my chest, staring into the mirror. My reflection was a blur at first, clouded by the last remnants of steam. I wiped the glass with my palm, revealing a face I didn't recognize. My cheeks were still flushed. My mouth was slightly parted. My eyes wide, dark, uncertain. I studied myself the way you'd study a stranger. Not to admire. To assess. To figure out what she was about to do next. There was no plan. No explanation. Just silence. I left the bathroom and walked back to the bedroom. The sheets were still messy from where I'd left them. Alvin hadn't stirred. His body lay face down, breathing steady, still deep in sleep. It was strange how quiet his world was. How unaware. There was something cruel about that, a universe inside one house that had split into two timelines, and only one of us knew it. I dressed slowly. Every motion felt weighted, deliberate. Underwear. Bra. Loose sweater. Leggings. The kind of outfit that suggested ease. Casualness. Normalcy. A costume for a version of me that no longer existed. In the kitchen, the morning sun was cutting across the countertops. Harsh and clear, too bright for what had just happened. I poured myself a glass of water, and it trembled in my hand before I could lift it to my lips. I didn't drink it. I just stood there, staring at the condensation on the side of the glass, my fingers tightening around the base. Images flashed without warning. His silhouette behind the steam. The tremble in his breath. The feel of his skin when we brushed. His uncertainty. My stillness. The space where right and wrong should have shouted, but instead whispered something dangerous. What do you do when the line you never thought you'd cross isn't behind you, but under you? I walked to the sink and dumped the water out. The glass clinked as I set it down. Too loud. I couldn't tell if I felt sick or empty. Maybe both. The kind of emptiness that has a pulse. Somewhere down the hall, I heard a door shut. Caden's, maybe. Or mine. Or both. The house had a way of echoing things differently now. The day moved forward like it always did. The clock ticked. A car drove by. Birds chirped. Everything sounded normal, which somehow made it worse. I wandered to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, legs pulled under me. My hands trembled slightly as I ran my fingers through my damp hair, trying to ground myself in something, anything. But everything felt foreign. My body. This house. The very air I was breathing. A part of me wanted to cry. Another part of me thought that would be too easy. There was no breaking down. Not yet. Just the slow, quiet ache of knowing you've done something irreversible, and now all you can do is wait to feel it fully. Outside, the light shifted. And inside, I sat with it. Not moving. Not thinking. By noon, the house felt too still. The morning haze had burned off, leaving streaks of sunlight across the floor like lines I didn't remember crossing. The warmth coming through the windows didn't feel comforting, it felt exposed. Harsh. Honest. I moved through it like someone trying not to leave footprints. Caden stayed in his room. I could hear the occasional shift of furniture, the creak of the mattress, the faint hum of something playing on his phone. But he didn't come out, and I didn't knock. The space between our doors felt wider than the walls that held them. I busied myself with chores I didn't care about. Folding laundry I didn't remember washing. Rinsing dishes that weren't dirty. Rearranging the fruit bowl just to touch something real. I kept expecting a surge of regret to come crashing in, some wave of panic that would pull me under, but it never did. What came instead was worse, a silence I couldn't fill and a sense that the air had shifted in the house, permanently. Everything felt familiar but foreign. My reflection in the hallway mirror. The softness of my sweater. The ticking of the kitchen clock. These were the same things I passed by every day, but now they moved around me like strangers wearing familiar clothes. Alvin called around 1:30. I watched the phone ring on the counter without reaching for it. The screen lit up with his name. My husband. The man I'd shared a bed with for nearly 10 years. The man who hadn't asked me about my day in weeks. I let it ring until it stopped. I didn't know what I would have said. I didn't feel married in that moment. I didn't feel anything that belonged to someone else. What I felt was mine alone, and I wasn't ready to explain it, least of all to him. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. For a second, my chest tightened. I held my breath, expecting footsteps, maybe eye contact. Maybe something. But they faded quickly. He must have gone back to his room. I sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, palms pressed against my face. My skin was warm, not from fever, but from something restless, something unfinished. Guilt hadn't arrived as a scream. It was showing up in waves, subtle and slow, curling around me like the steam from earlier, slipping into my bones. What do you call something that wasn't planned, but still happened exactly the way you let it? How do you measure the weight of a moment that doesn't feel like an accident? I told myself it was brief, that it hadn't meant anything. But the problem with moments like that is they don't end when they're over. They echo. They stain. I thought of Caden's face, how young he looked when he stepped into the bathroom. Not naive. Just open. Like he didn't know yet how complicated people can be. I'd seen fear in his eyes. But I'd also seen trust. And I knew which one mattered more. Downstairs, the wind knocked lightly against the windows. A single leaf clung to the glass like it was trying to hold on. I stood and watched it for too long, wishing I could trade places with something so weightless. There were no sirens, no slammed doors, no collapse of the roof. But something had broken in the foundation of this house, and we both knew it. It wasn't loud. It was quiet in the way guilt always is, polite, patient, waiting for you to notice it's never going away. I walked into the hallway, not sure what I was looking for. His door was cracked slightly, but I didn't reach for the knob. The air near it felt different. Warmer, heavier. Like even the wood remembered what we'd done. Back in my room, I sat again. Not out of exhaustion, but because I didn't know what movement looked like after this. I glanced at my phone. The screen was blank now. No missed calls. No messages. Just a black mirror reflecting someone I wasn't used to seeing. Outside, the sun had dipped just enough to cast long shadows across the carpet. Inside, I sat in the thick of everything I couldn't undo. Not crying. Not speaking. Just facing it. Thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments.